The desert holds its secrets in silence. In the winter months of 1983, when the Arizona sun softened and the temperatures dipped below 90 degrees, the first rose appeared on a body found near the outskirts of Scottsdale. The woman had been missing for 3 days. Her name was Catherine Brennan, though later records would note this as an altered identification. She was 27 years old, worked as a medical receptionist, and had last been seen leaving a grocery store parking lot on a Thursday evening. The rose lay across her chest, red petals already browning at the edges in the dry air. Detectives photographed it carefully, noting the thornless stem, the precise placement, the way it seemed to have been positioned with deliberate care. There was no note, no other marker, just the flower and the silence of the desert stretching in all directions. Phoenix in the early 1980s carried a peculiar quality of expansion and isolation. The city sprawled outward in geometric patterns, subdivisions appearing like mirages between stretches of undeveloped land. Shopping centers stood alone on empty roads that would, within a decade, become congested arteries. The population had doubled since 1970, bringing new residents who knew nothing of the desert's older rhythms, who drove air-conditioned cars between air-conditioned buildings and rarely walked anywhere. This was a landscape that made disappearance easy. A person could vanish between 2 points of light and fall into darkness that seemed absolute. The police department had been growing too, adding detectives and patrol officers to match the expanding grid, but the vastness always outpaced the manpower. Calls came in about missing persons regularly, most resolved within 48 hours when someone turned up in Tucson or decided to skip town entirely. Catherine Brennan's case began as one number among many, filed and assigned, routine, until the rose transformed it into something else. The city itself seemed designed for anonymity. Unlike older urban centers where neighborhoods maintained distinct identities and longtime residents knew their neighbors by name, Phoenix's rapid expansion created a transient quality where people moved through spaces without establishing roots. The subdivisions that appeared overnight housed newcomers from California, the Midwest, the East Coast, all drawn by promises of sunshine and affordability and the possibility of reinvention. Shopping centers served as the primary gathering points, air-conditioned oases where people made necessary purchases before returning to their homes, their cars, their isolated routines. Social connection happened less frequently than in places where people walked streets and encountered each other randomly. The automobile dominated every aspect of daily life, determining which routes people traveled, which places they visited, who they might encounter. This created predictable patterns that someone observant could learn and exploit. The same parking lots at the same times of day, the same grocery stores on Thursday evenings, the same gas stations on the drive home from work. Catherine Brennan had been a creature of routine, as most people were. She shopped at the same supermarket every Thursday after leaving her job at the medical clinic. She parked in approximately the same area of the lot near the shopping cart return for convenience. These patterns, which made life efficient and manageable, also made her vulnerable to someone who understood that consistency created opportunity. Detective Michael Havers received the case on a Friday morning. He had been with the department for 11 years, working homicide for the last 6, and had developed a reputation for methodical attention. He read incident reports 3 times before making calls, kept detailed timelines in narrow-ruled notebooks, and avoided jumping to conclusions. When he arrived at the medical examiner's office, he asked to see the rose before seeing the body. The flower had been placed in a clear evidence bag, its color already fading to burgundy. The medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, pointed out that the stem had been cut cleanly, almost professionally, and that all thorns had been removed with what appeared to be a sharp blade. The variety was common, available at any florist or grocery store in the Phoenix metropolitan area. There were no fingerprints, no identifying marks, just the gesture itself, which felt both intimate and performative, as though someone had needed to mark the death with beauty, or perhaps had needed to claim it in some personal way. Havers spent the next 2 weeks reconstructing Catherine Brennan's final days. She had lived alone in a small apartment complex near Camelback Road, worked consistent hours at a medical clinic, and maintained a quiet social life limited to a few close friends and occasional dates. There was no ex-boyfriend with a grudge, no workplace conflict, no outstanding debts. Witnesses at the grocery store remembered seeing her load bags into the trunk of her white Honda Accord, but couldn't recall anyone approaching her. The parking lot had no security cameras. The store's fluorescent lights cast everything in the same flat brightness, making observation without memory nearly impossible. Havers interviewed the cashier, the bag boy, 3 other shoppers who had been present. None of them had seen anything unusual. A woman had loaded groceries into her car and driven away. The groceries were never found. Her car was discovered 4 days later in a different parking lot, this one belonging to a closed furniture store on the east side of the city, keys still in the ignition. The interior had been wiped clean. 3 months passed before the second rose appeared. The victim's name in records became Susan Morrison, age 31, a paralegal who had disappeared after leaving a restaurant where she had dined alone on a Tuesday evening. Her body was found in a vacant lot near Glendale, positioned carefully on her back with her hands folded across her stomach. The rose lay precisely where the first one had, across the chest, red against the pale fabric of her blouse. Havers responded to the scene within an hour of the call. He stood at a distance studying the arrangement before approaching. The positioning showed the same deliberate care, the same attention to aesthetic detail. Dr. Vance, arriving shortly after, noted the similarity immediately. 2 women, both in their late 20s or early 30s, both found in isolated locations at the city's edges, both marked with thornless red roses. The connection seemed obvious, but Havers resisted calling it a pattern, with only 2 data points. Patterns required repetition, required enough instances to establish probability. 2 could still be coincidence, though his instinct said otherwise. The discovery of Susan Morrison's body forced a shift in investigative approach. What had been a single tragic case now suggested serial behavior, which brought different protocols and resources into play. Havers requested a meeting with the department captain, presenting the evidence parallels in a conference room with photographs pinned to a corkboard. The positioning of both bodies showed identical arrangement. The rose placement was too specific to be coincidental. The victim profiles shared significant overlap. Both women lived alone, both maintained regular employment, both had been taken from public spaces in the evening hours. The geographic locations differed, but the isolation was consistent. The captain, a man named Robert Travers who had worked homicide during the less complicated 1960s, listened without interrupting and then authorized additional detective hours and forensic resources. He also instituted a media blackout on the rose detail, understanding that public knowledge of the signature might both generate tips and inspire panic. The decision to withhold information from the press created tension with reporters who sensed a larger story, but also protected the investigation's ability to use the rose as verification element when evaluating potential suspects or confessions. Susan Morrison had been a methodical person who kept detailed calendars and maintained organized files. Her apartment, searched thoroughly by Havers and Reeves in the days following her identification, revealed a life structured around professional ambition and personal independence. She had been saving money toward buying a condominium, tracking expenses in ledgers that showed careful budgeting. She had been taking evening classes toward a law degree, determined to advance from paralegal to attorney, despite the challenges of working full-time while studying. Her colleagues at the law firm where she worked described her as focused and reliable, someone who arrived early and stayed late, who volunteered for difficult assignments and maintained composure under pressure. Her social life was limited, not from isolation, but from deliberate prioritization of career goals. She dated occasionally, had a small circle of close friends, spoke to her parents by phone every Sunday evening. The restaurant where she had eaten her final meal was a place she visited regularly, usually alone with a book or legal documents, treating dinner as a productive extension of her workday. The staff remembered her as a regular customer who ordered the same thing, sat at the same table, always left a precise 20% tip. These details painted a portrait of someone who had constructed a purposeful life, who knew what she wanted and worked steadily toward achieving it. The interruption of that trajectory by violence seemed especially cruel in its randomness. Morrison had been disciplined, careful, organized in all her choices, and none of that had protected her from becoming a target for someone whose selection criteria existed outside rational assessment of risk or behavior. The investigation expanded. Havers requested additional resources and received one junior detective, Thomas Reeves, a recent transfer from property crimes who brought energy but limited experience. They began mapping the disappearances, marking last known locations on a large wall map of Phoenix and its surrounding communities. Catherine Brennan from Scottsdale, Susan Morrison from Central Phoenix. Both had been alone when they vanished. Both had been found within 10 miles of their disappearance sites, but in opposite directions, as though someone were deliberately avoiding patterns in geography while maintaining consistency in method. Havers drove the routes himself, timing the distances, noting which roads stayed empty after dark, where the streetlights failed, where the desert pressed closest to the pavement. He began to understand that whoever was doing this knew the city's gaps intimately, understood which spaces existed between attention. The third rose arrived in August of 1984. Jennifer Caldwell, 29, a bank teller who had last been seen leaving work on a Friday afternoon. Her body was discovered near Tempe, arranged with the same careful positioning, the same red rose across her chest. This time, a witness came forward. A man who had been changing a tire on the same road 2 weeks earlier remembered seeing a dark-colored van parked in the area, engine running. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Vans were common, especially work vehicles, but something about the way it sat there, idling in the heat with no one visible inside, had stuck in his memory. Havers interviewed him twice, pressing for details. The witness thought the van might have been blue or dark green, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet. Older model from the late 70s. No visible company markings, no distinguishing features. The description was too vague to pursue effectively, but Havers added it to the growing file. A vehicle meant mobility, meant the ability to move between locations without drawing attention. A van meant space, meant the possibility of concealment. He began looking at traffic patterns, at which routes would allow someone to move between the 3 locations without using major intersections where cameras might exist. The roses became a signature that the media discovered by September. A reporter at the Arizona Republic received an anonymous tip about the common elements between 3 unsolved cases, and once the story appeared, the public response shifted. Suddenly, the 3 deaths transformed from isolated incidents into a narrative, a serial pattern that demanded explanation. The newspaper coined the term "rose killer," which Havers found both reductive and disturbingly romantic. He issued a statement urging caution, asking the public for information rather than speculation, but the story had acquired its own momentum. Tips flooded the department's phone lines. People reported seeing roses in unusual places, remembered neighbors who kept rose bushes, recalled men who seemed suspicious. Havers and Reeves worked through the calls methodically, following up on anything remotely credible, finding nothing substantial. The attention added pressure but no clarity. The killer, whoever he was, continued operating in the city's blind spots, moving through spaces that existed between observation. The psychological profile arrived from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in October. The analyst, whose name appeared on official letterhead as Special Agent Carolyn Mendez, outlined a likely suspect profile based on the evidence patterns. Male, probably between 30 and 45 years old, employed in a job that required driving or allowed flexible hours, familiar with the Phoenix area through long residency or extensive time spent there. The rose signature suggested ritualistic thinking, a need to impose beauty or meaning onto violent acts, possibly rooted in childhood experiences or religious concepts about death and commemoration. The careful positioning of bodies indicated someone who spent time at the scenes, who felt safe enough to linger, suggesting either late-night operations or locations remote enough to guarantee privacy. The profile noted that this individual likely appeared normal in daily life, maintained employment, possibly interacted regularly with people without raising suspicion. The thornless roses suggested advanced preparation, implied someone who planned these events rather than acting impulsively. Havers read the profile multiple times, finding it both helpful and frustratingly broad. Thousands of men in Phoenix could match these parameters. The specificity lay not in the profile, but in catching the moment when normalcy cracked, when the pattern became visible. The profile included detailed sections on the psychological dynamics underlying ritualistic murder. Agent Mendez explained that the rose signature served multiple functions in the offender's internal logic. It marked completion, transformed violence into something the offender could frame as meaningful rather than destructive. The removal of thorns suggested someone who wanted to offer something pure, stripped of pain or harm, which indicated profound cognitive distortion about the nature of his actions. In the offender's mind, the profile suggested he was not committing murder, but performing some kind of service or transformation. The women became objects in a personal mythology that allowed him to act without experiencing guilt or remorse in the conventional sense. This type of ritualistic thinking often developed over time, beginning with fantasy and progressing toward action as internal prohibitions weakened and the need to manifest the fantasy in reality grew stronger. The profile predicted that there might have been earlier attempts or aborted incidents before the pattern became fully established, moments when the offender approached the edge of action but pulled back, practicing or rehearsing before committing fully. The document also addressed the question of victim selection, which appeared to follow both conscious and unconscious criteria. The women were all in their late 20s to early 30s, lived independently, maintained professional employment, and presented as competent, self-sufficient individuals. They were not particularly vulnerable in the conventional sense. They did not engage in high-risk behaviors, did not work in dangerous environments, did not associate with criminal elements. They were ordinary women living ordinary lives, which suggested the offender's selection process focused on availability and opportunity rather than specific victim characteristics. However, the age range consistency suggested some internal template, some image or association that made women in this demographic category more appealing as targets. The profile noted that serial offenders often selected victims who represented some unresolved psychological conflict or symbolized a relationship from their past. The women might remind the offender of someone specific, or they might embody qualities that triggered his compulsion. Without interviewing the actual offender, determining the precise psychological mechanism remained speculative, but the pattern indicated purpose rather than random selection. The tactical recommendations section of the profile proved most useful for the active investigation. Mendez suggested focusing on employment sectors that provided access to vehicles and flexible schedules, maintenance work, delivery services, transportation companies, utility workers. The profile recommended checking for recent divorces or significant life stressors in the target demographic, as serial offenders often experienced triggering events that precipitated the transition from fantasy to action. She noted that the offender likely lived alone or in a situation that provided significant privacy, given the advanced preparation required. He might have a dedicated space for storing materials, for planning, for processing the psychological aftermath of his actions. The profile recommended examining anyone who had moved to Phoenix within the past 5 years, as geographic relocation often accompanied the development of serial patterns. New environments provided both opportunity and psychological distance from previous identities. Someone could become a different person in a place where no one knew their history, where they could construct themselves according to internal imperatives without external checks from family or long-time acquaintances who might notice changes in behavior or attitude. The fourth rose appeared in November, then the fifth in January of 1985. Each time the same elements repeated with mechanical consistency. Women between 27 and 33 years old, living alone, last seen in public places, bodies found in desert areas at the city's periphery, positioned identically, marked with thornless red roses. Havers began seeing the pattern in his sleep, the precise arrangement of hands, the exact placement of flowers. He and Reeves expanded their investigation, cross-referencing employment records, vehicle registrations, florist purchases. They interviewed staff at every flower shop in the metropolitan area, asking about customers who regularly bought red roses or requested thornless stems. Most shops simply cut the thorns off themselves if asked. The flower trail led nowhere. They reviewed surveillance footage from parking lots and shopping centers, looking for the dark van the witness had described, finding hundreds of similar vehicles and no way to narrow the search. The cases accumulated in folders that grew thicker without growing clearer. The break came from an unexpected direction in March of 1985. A woman named Rachel Stokes, 28 years old, survived. She had been loading groceries into her car behind a supermarket in Mesa when a man approached asking for directions. She remembered him as pleasant-looking, average height, wearing a blue work shirt and jeans. He had smiled while asking about the fastest route to Chandler. As she began explaining, he moved closer, and something in the shift of his posture made her step backward. He lunged forward and she screamed, dropping her grocery bags, keys clutched in her fist. A store employee taking out trash heard the scream and came running. The man ran back to a van parked 3 spaces away, dark green, older model, and drove away quickly. Rachel Stokes was shaken but unharmed. She sat in the police interview room for 2 hours, working with a sketch artist, describing everything she could remember about the man's face, his voice, the way he moved. The sketch that emerged showed a man with short, dark hair, clean-shaven, pleasant features, utterly unremarkable. He looked like 10,000 other men, but combined with the van description and the location pattern, the attempted abduction represented the first real lead in 18 months. Havers distributed the sketch to every patrol officer in the Phoenix metropolitan area, with instructions to watch for the described van, particularly in the evening hours near shopping centers and grocery stores. He organized stakeouts at locations matching the pattern, rotating teams through 2-week shifts. The surveillance produced nothing for 5 weeks. Then, on a Thursday evening in late April, a patrol officer named David Chen spotted a dark green Chevrolet van, matching the general description, parked behind a grocery store in North Phoenix. The van was empty but running, positioned where it had a clear view of the rear entrance. Chen called for backup and waited. 30 minutes later, a man emerged from the direction of the store, walking with purpose toward the van. He matched the general description from the sketch. Chen and 2 other officers moved in before the man reached the vehicle. His name was Walter Eugene Prescott, age 37, employed as a maintenance supervisor for a property management company that operated multiple apartment complexes across the Phoenix area. He had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1981. He lived alone in a modest house in Peoria, had been divorced for 4 years, and by all accounts maintained steady employment and quiet habits. In his van, officers found a toolbox containing, among other maintenance equipment, a folding knife with a clean blade and 6 red roses wrapped in plastic, their thorns removed. The arrest happened without drama. Prescott did not resist, did not speak, except to acknowledge his name. Havers arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, watched as the van was processed, photographed, searched. The interior had been cleaned recently, the smell of chemical disinfectant obvious. No blood evidence would later be found, despite extensive forensic testing. The roses in their plastic wrap represented the most significant discovery, along with a detailed map of Phoenix marked with small X's in locations that, when checked against case files, corresponded precisely to where bodies had been found. The map was folded carefully and stored in the glove compartment, as though Prescott had needed to keep track of his pattern to see it laid out geographically. Havers stood in the parking lot after the van had been towed to the crime lab, watching the last light drain from the western sky, feeling something that was not quite relief. The pattern had been stopped, but it had already claimed 5 lives. The roses that Prescott had been carrying, presumably meant for a 6th victim, were instead catalogued as evidence and locked away. The interrogation proceeded slowly over 3 days. Prescott initially said nothing, sitting in the interview room with a lawyer present, responding to questions with silence or single-word answers. On the 2nd day, confronted with the map, with the roses, with Rachel Stokes's identification, he began to speak. His voice was quiet, almost contemplative. He talked about the roses as though they were gifts, necessary gestures of respect and beauty in response to what he called the transition. He had selected each woman carefully, watching from parking lots, following routines, waiting for moments of isolation. The van, which he drove for work, allowed him to move through neighborhoods without attracting attention. Maintenance vehicles belonged everywhere and nowhere, invisible in their utility. He had removed the thorns from roses, he explained, because thorns represented pain, and he wanted to offer something pure, something beautiful. The women had become, in his accounting, released from struggle, freed into peace. The roses marked that transformation. Dr. Mendez's profile had been remarkably accurate. Prescott appeared completely normal, spoke calmly, showed no obvious signs of the ritualized violence his actions represented. Havers listened to the confession across 3 days of recorded testimony, understanding that the banality was itself the horror. Prescott lived in the same world everyone else inhabited, drove the same roads, shopped at the same stores, and within that normalcy he had constructed a parallel logic that justified murder as an act of aesthetic mercy. The interrogation revealed layers of planning that extended far beyond what the physical evidence had suggested. Prescott described watching potential victims for days or sometimes weeks before acting. He would notice a woman shopping alone, follow her car at a distance to learn her route home, return to the same location on subsequent days to observe whether she maintained predictable patterns. He looked for women who lived alone, who carried themselves with independence, who seemed to exist without obvious external support systems. The selection criteria emerged from extended observation rather than immediate opportunity. This patient surveillance allowed him to minimize risk while maximizing control. He knew where each woman would be at specific times, understood their routines well enough to predict behavior, could position himself in their paths without seeming out of place. The maintenance van was crucial to this methodology. Parked near shopping centers or apartment complexes, it appeared legitimate, drew no attention. He could sit inside for hours without arousing suspicion. People expected maintenance vehicles to be present in commercial areas and residential neighborhoods. The van's anonymity provided perfect cover for surveillance activities that would have seemed threatening if conducted from a personal vehicle. Prescott's description of the actual abductions was clinical, stripped of emotion. He would approach as they were loading groceries or walking to their cars, ask for directions or assistance, use the momentary engagement to close distance. Once close enough, he would produce a knife, not to threaten explicitly, but to indicate capacity for harm, to short-circuit resistance through implication of what could happen if they screamed or fought. He moved them to the van quickly, binding their hands with zip ties he kept ready, covering their mouths with tape. The efficiency came from planning. He had practiced the movements, timed the actions, understood exactly how to transition from normal interaction to control within seconds. The van's interior had been modified with hooks welded to the floor that could anchor restraints, keeping victims immobilized during transport. He drove carefully, obeying speed limits, using surface streets rather than highways to avoid traffic cameras. The journeys to disposal sites took between 20 and 40 minutes depending on destination. He played classical music from a tape deck, Mozart primarily, believing the music created appropriate atmosphere for what he termed the crossing over process. The roses received extensive discussion during the interrogation. Prescott bought them from different florists, never establishing a pattern at any single location. He purchased 2 or 3 stems at a time, along with other items, greeting cards or vases, making the flowers seem incidental to some larger purpose. He would mention making arrangements for his mother or preparing for a date, casual comments that established normal context for the purchase. The florists remembered nothing remarkable about these transactions. He took the roses home, removed thorns carefully using a paring knife, working over newspaper to catch the debris. The thorn removal took approximately 15 minutes per stem, requiring attention and precision. He found this preparation calming, almost meditative. It transformed the roses from natural objects into refined symbols, stripped of defensive mechanisms, purely beautiful. He kept the prepared roses in his refrigerator, wrapped in damp paper towels until needed. The refrigeration preserved freshness, ensured that the roses he placed on bodies were vibrant rather than wilted. This attention to aesthetic detail was crucial to his ritualistic thinking. The roses had to represent perfection, beauty, untainted by decay. They marked the completion of his self-defined purpose, transforming violent death into something he could frame as transcendent. His explanation of the body positioning revealed the same ritualistic precision. After death, which occurred through strangulation in all 5 cases, according to forensic evidence. Though Prescott refused to discuss specific methodology, he would spend time arranging the bodies. Hands folded across stomach, legs extended and parallel, head positioned to face upward. The positioning took several minutes of adjustment, ensuring symmetry and peace. He described wanting the women to appear restful, as though sleeping rather than dead. The rose came last, placed carefully across the chest, centered precisely. He would step back and observe his work, adjusting if anything seemed asymmetrical or wrong. This post-mortem ritual consumed 30 to 60 minutes at each site, time during which he was vulnerable to discovery, but which he felt compelled to invest. The ritual mattered more than safety. Without the proper arrangement, without the rose precisely placed, The action would be incomplete, meaningless. The ritual transformed what he did from mere killing into something that fit his internal narrative about purpose and beauty and release. Havers, listening to this explanation, understood that arguing with Prescott's logic was pointless. The man existed in a psychological framework that operated by rules incomprehensible to anyone outside it. The confession was useful for its factual details, but its psychological content remained alien, resistant to normal interpretation or understanding. The trial began in September of 1985 and lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence connecting Prescott to all 5 murders. Forensic testimony established that rose petals found in his van matched botanical characteristics of petals recovered from the bodies. The map in his glove compartment marked locations known only to investigators. Rachel Stokes testified about the attempted abduction, identifying Prescott without hesitation. The defense attempted to argue insanity, suggesting that Prescott's ritualistic behavior indicated mental illness rather than criminal intent. A parade of psychiatric experts testified about delusional thinking, about dissociative states, about the psychological mechanisms that might allow someone to commit violent acts while maintaining surface functionality. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted kidnapping. The judge, a woman named Margaret Harrison who had presided with stern efficiency throughout the trial, delivered the sentence 2 weeks later. Arizona law in 1985 provided for capital punishment in cases of multiple murder. Prescott was sentenced to death by lethal injection, the state's method having changed from the gas chamber in 1983. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read, sitting motionless between his attorneys, staring at a point somewhere in the middle distance. Appeals would continue for years, but the outcome remained fixed. Walter Eugene Prescott would die in state custody, his pattern ended by legal certainty. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically across 3 weeks of testimony that built layer upon layer of damning evidence. The lead prosecutor, a veteran named Thomas Garrett who had handled multiple death penalty cases, began with the basics. 5 women disappeared from public locations in Phoenix between February 1983 and January 1985. All 5 were found in isolated desert areas at the city's periphery. All 5 showed the same careful body positioning. All 5 had a red rose placed on their chest. The consistency alone established pattern, but Garrett went further, bringing in forensic botanists who testified about the specific rose variety, about the clean cuts that suggested professional florist tools or at minimum someone with experience handling flowers. Crime scene technicians described the painstaking documentation process, presenting hundreds of photographs that showed identical positioning across all 5 crime scenes. The visual evidence was powerful, forcing the jury to see the deliberate repetition, the ritualistic nature of the staging. The second week focused on physical evidence linking Prescott to the crimes. The dark green Chevrolet van became central to this phase of testimony. Traffic camera footage, though limited in 1985, captured a vehicle matching the van's description near 2 of the abduction sites at relevant times. Witnesses came forward, prompted by the arrest publicity, reporting that they had seen a similar van in various locations, sometimes idling in parking lots, sometimes moving slowly through neighborhoods. The cumulative effect of this testimony created a picture of surveillance and stalking, of someone who spent time watching and waiting before acting. The map found in Prescott's glove compartment received extensive attention. A forensic document examiner testified about the markings, about ink analysis that showed the locations had been marked at different times, suggesting Prescott had kept a running record of his crimes. The roses found in his van at the time of arrest were identified by 3 separate florists as having come from their shops, though none could specifically remember Prescott making the purchases. He had paid cash, had been unremarkable, had blended into the stream of customers buying flowers for various purposes. The thornless state of the roses matched the condition of flowers found on all 5 bodies. Combined, this physical evidence created an overwhelming case for Prescott's involvement. The third week brought the most emotionally difficult testimony. Rachel Stokes described the attempted abduction in detail that matched all the previous patterns. She identified Prescott in court without hesitation, pointing directly at him, while describing how his initial friendliness had shifted to aggression in seconds. Her survival depended on immediate screaming and the fortunate presence of the store employee, but her testimony provided crucial evidence about Prescott's methodology. Family members of the 5 victims testified about their loved ones, about the women's lives and routines, and plans for futures that were stolen. Catherine Brennan's mother described her daughter's dedication to her medical receptionist work, her kindness with patients, her dream of eventually becoming a nurse. Susan Morrison's sister talked about Morrison's determination to become a lawyer, about the evening law school classes and study sessions, about ambition cut short. Jennifer Caldwell's father, a retired teacher, spoke about his daughter's love of reading and her desire to travel to Italy, about the savings account that would never be used. The other victims' families provided similar testimony, each adding specificity to women who might otherwise become statistics. The prosecution's strategy was clear: establish the defendant's guilt through evidence, then underscore the human cost through personal testimony that made the victims real rather than abstract. The jury listened with visible attention, several members taking notes, all of them focused on the families who were trying to convey the magnitude of their loss within the formal constraints of courtroom procedure. The defense case occupied 1 week. Prescott's attorneys, court-appointed public defenders who had worked diligently despite the challenging circumstances, focused exclusively on the insanity argument. They presented psychiatric experts who had evaluated Prescott during the months following his arrest. These experts testified about ritualistic compulsions, about psychological compartmentalization that allowed contradictory beliefs to coexist without producing obvious external symptoms. One psychiatrist described Prescott's worldview as containing a parallel logic system that operated independently from his surface personality. In this internal system, the murders represented acts of transformation or release, almost spiritual in their significance to Prescott's distorted thinking. The roses embodied this transformation, marking completion of some process that Prescott believed was necessary or even beneficial. The defense argued that this level of psychological distortion indicated mental illness that precluded criminal responsibility. The prosecution's rebuttal experts countered that awareness of right and wrong, the ability to plan and execute complex actions, and the deliberate concealment of crimes all demonstrated legal sanity regardless of underlying psychological abnormality. The distinction between mental illness and legal insanity became the central question, and the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution's interpretation. Prescott knew what he was doing, understood it was wrong according to societal standards, and took steps to avoid detection. The ritualistic elements might indicate psychological disturbance, but they did not constitute legal insanity. The impact on the community extended beyond the immediate relief of an arrest. The 5 women whose lives ended with red roses across their chests left behind families, friends, colleagues who struggled to make sense of their absence. Catherine Brennan's mother attended every day of the trial, sitting in the same seat in the 3rd row, taking notes that she would later compile into a letter-writing campaign advocating for victims' rights legislation. Susan Morrison's sister became active in support groups for families of murder victims, creating networks of connection for people navigating grief without closure. Jennifer Caldwell's colleagues at the bank established a memorial scholarship for women pursuing degrees in criminal justice, wanting to transform loss into something that might prevent future loss. The women became more than the roses left on their bodies, more than entries in criminal files. They were remembered as individuals with specific laughs, particular dreams, unique ways of moving through the world. The memorial service held 6 months after the trial drew hundreds of people to a community center in Phoenix, filling the space with photographs and stories that reasserted life against the reduction of death. Havers attended, standing at the back of the room, listening to the accumulation of details that made each woman specific, irreplaceable, missed. The broader community response involved both collective trauma and collective action. Public safety awareness increased dramatically in the months following Prescott's arrest. Women's self-defense courses saw enrollment surge. Parking lot security became a priority for shopping centers that had previously relied on minimal lighting and occasional patrols. Grocery stores installed better illumination and increased the frequency of security sweeps during evening hours. These changes emerged from a shared understanding that the ordinary spaces of daily life could harbor extraordinary danger. that routine activities like shopping or dining out carried risks that needed active management. The changes were practical and psychological. Better lighting made crime less likely, but also made people feel safer, which was itself valuable. The fear that had permeated Phoenix during the active investigation did not disappear immediately after Prescott's arrest. It persisted in modified form, manifesting as heightened vigilance, as changed behaviors that became habits even after the immediate threat had been eliminated. The victims' families formed an advocacy organization called Silent Voices, dedicated to supporting families of murder victims and pushing for legislative changes that would prioritize victim impact in criminal proceedings. Catherine Brennan's mother, whose name in public records appeared as Margaret Chen, became the organization's first director, channeling her grief into institutional reform. The organization lobbied for Arizona's Victim Rights Amendment, which passed in 1990 and granted victims' families the right to be present and heard during all phases of criminal proceedings. They established a crisis response network that connected newly bereaved families with others who had traveled similar paths, providing peer support and practical guidance about navigating the criminal justice system. They created educational materials about safety awareness and crime prevention, distributed through schools and community centers. The organization became a permanent fixture in Phoenix's civic landscape, its existence a direct legacy of the Rose Killer case. The transformation of personal tragedy into institutional advocacy represented one way that loss could be metabolized into meaning, though no amount of advocacy could restore what had been taken or erase the fundamental injustice of death by violence. Susan Morrison's sister, identified in records as Ellen Morrison Garcia, took a different but equally significant path. She became a victim's advocate, working directly within the criminal justice system, attending trials with families, helping them understand procedures, ensuring their voices were heard during sentencing. She had been a high school English teacher before her sister's murder, but the experience of navigating the trial and its aftermath revealed a need for someone who could translate between the legal system's formal processes and families' emotional realities. She pursued additional training, eventually working full-time for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, in a position specifically created to support victim services. Her work touched hundreds of cases over the following decades, each one carrying echoes of her own experience, but also requiring fresh attention to each family's particular needs and circumstances. She understood that grief had individual expressions, that some families needed detailed information about every procedural step, while others needed to maintain distance from specifics. Her ability to calibrate her support to different needs emerged directly from having experienced the confusion and overwhelm of being suddenly thrust into the criminal justice system's machinery without preparation or guidance. Jennifer Caldwell's father, whose name appeared in court documents as Richard Caldwell, approached his loss through more private channels. He established the scholarship fund at the bank where his daughter had worked, endowing it with money from her life insurance policy and his own retirement savings. The scholarship funded women pursuing degrees in criminal justice, forensic science, or law enforcement, fields his daughter had never considered, but which became meaningful to him as ways to honor her memory through others' work in preventing and solving crimes. He attended the scholarship award ceremonies every year, meeting the recipients, hearing about their studies and career aspirations, finding some measure of comfort in supporting work that addressed, however indirectly, the kind of violence that had taken his daughter. He never spoke publicly about the case, declined all media requests, maintained a dignified privacy that was itself a form of resistance against the sensationalism that surrounded serial murder cases. His grief remained personal, shared only with close family and a small circle of friends who had known Jennifer and who remembered her as more than a victim in a famous case. The other two victims' families, whose identities remained more protected in public records, found their own paths through loss. One family moved away from Arizona entirely, seeking geographical distance from the place where trauma had occurred, starting over in a state where they did not carry the weight of public recognition or media attention. The other family stayed, but withdrew from public engagement, maintaining their privacy while supporting the advocacy work of others. There was no single correct response to the aftermath of murder, no prescribed pathway through grief that worked universally. Each family constructed their own methods of survival, their own ways of integrating the rupture into their ongoing lives. The community that formed among them, facilitated by the trial and the memorial services and the advocacy organization, provided connection but not uniformity. They shared certain experiences but responded to them differently, and the respect for these differences became part of how they supported each other across years and decades. The investigation itself had transformed the Phoenix Police Department's approach to serial crime. The case files became training material for detectives learning to recognize patterns across jurisdictions and time periods. The coordination between patrol officers and detectives that had led to Prescott's arrest was studied as a model for effective multi-unit collaboration. The FBI included the case in its database of solved serial murders, using Prescott's profile and the investigation's methodology as reference points for future cases. Dr. Mendez published an academic paper analyzing the ritualistic elements, the rose signature, the geographical distribution of crime scenes. The case existed now as both specific tragedy and abstract data, particular deaths and general pattern. Havers kept all his original notebooks, the handwritten timelines and maps, filed in boxes in his garage. He never looked at them after the trial ended, but he kept them, understanding that the weight of the investigation was not something that could be discarded simply because the case was closed. The question of motive remained ultimately unanswerable despite the confession and trial testimony. Prescott offered explanations rooted in his private logic about beauty and transition and peace, but these explanations did not satisfy the fundamental question of why. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a childhood marked by emotional neglect, a mother who had suffered from depression, a father who had left when Prescott was 9 years old. He had been an average student, had held various jobs, had married and divorced without producing children. Nothing in his history obviously predicted the transformation into someone who would kill multiple women and mark their deaths with roses. The gap between the known facts of his life and the reality of his actions remained unbridgeable. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case for those who studied it afterward, the absence of a clear origin point, the way that violence seemed to emerge from ordinary circumstances without obvious cause. It challenged the reassuring belief that such things happened for reasons that could be identified and prevented. Sometimes the pattern existed only in the actions themselves, not in the biography that preceded them. The property management company that had employed Prescott went through extensive scrutiny in the months following his arrest. Investigators examined every apartment complex he had serviced, looking for other potential victims, finding none. Residents he had interacted with during maintenance calls reported that he had been polite, efficient, forgettable. He had fixed plumbing problems, repaired locks, painted walls, performed all the minor tasks that kept buildings functional. He had access to vacant units, to storage areas, to mechanical rooms where people rarely went. The company implemented new policies requiring employees to work in pairs, to log all service calls with specific arrival and departure times, to undergo psychological screening as part of the hiring process. These measures were adopted across the industry, spreading through property management companies throughout Arizona and eventually to other states. Prescott's employment had provided both opportunity and cover, and the recognition of that fact changed how similar positions were structured and supervised. The administrative changes represented another layer of impact, the way one man's actions could reshape institutional practices across an entire sector. The execution did not happen for 15 years. Appeals moved through state and federal courts with the slow certainty of legal procedure, challenging trial procedures, questioning evidence admissibility, arguing constitutional violations in sentencing. Prescott remained on death row at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, maintaining minimal contact with the outside world, granting no interviews, offering no further explanations. In the year 2000, having exhausted all appeals, having been denied clemency by 2 successive governors, Walter Eugene Prescott was executed by lethal injection at 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The execution was witnessed by representatives from each victim's family, by officials from the Department of Corrections, by journalists who would report the details to newspapers that still remembered the case 15 years after it had dominated headlines. Havers did not attend. He had retired from the Phoenix Police Department 5 years earlier, and he saw no purpose in witnessing the final act of a story that had ended, for him, when Prescott's van had been towed away from that parking lot in 1985. The execution was the legal system following through on its pronouncement, necessary perhaps, but not meaningful in any personal sense. The pattern had been stopped when the arrests happened. Everything after was documentation and formality. The case left questions that extended beyond its specific facts. The roses, which had seemed so distinctive, appeared in other contexts that forced reconsideration. Serial offenders often used signatures or staging elements that felt personally significant. But the meaning of these elements remained locked inside minds that operated by private logic. The roses that Prescott placed on his victims' bodies meant something to him that he articulated only in fragments and metaphors that never quite cohered. Were they apology, tribute, claim of ownership, aesthetic gesture, or something else entirely? The answer, if there was one, existed in a psychological space that resisted translation into language that made sense outside its own borders. This was the limitation that investigators faced repeatedly. Understanding that a pattern existed was not the same as understanding what the pattern meant to the person creating it. The gap between behavioral observation and psychological comprehension remained permanent, unbridgeable by testimony or analysis. The city itself transformed in the years following the case. Phoenix continued its rapid expansion, sprawling further into the desert, filling the empty spaces where bodies had once been found with housing developments and shopping centers. The roads that Prescott had traveled between his hunting grounds became congested arteries packed with commuters. The vacant lots where he had positioned his victims disappeared under construction, covered by buildings that represented the city's relentless growth. The specific locations became less significant as the geography changed. Memory required landmarks, and when landmarks vanished, memory became more abstract, more difficult to maintain. The case existed now primarily in records and retrospective accounts, in the minds of people who remembered it directly, in the families who could never forget. The physical spaces that had held such terrible significance were erased by development, which was both mercy and loss. The city moved forward, building over its past, leaving the pattern visible only to those who knew to look for it. The 5 women whose deaths defined the case remained absent in specific ways that persisted despite the legal conclusion. Catherine Brennan would have been in her late 60s if she had lived to the present day. Susan Morrison had been planning to go back to school for a degree in social work. Jennifer Caldwell had wanted to travel to Europe, had been saving money toward a trip to Italy. The other 2 women, whose names appeared in records as altered identifications to protect their families, had their own particular futures that were eliminated on desert roads in the mid-1980s. These were not abstract losses, but the accumulation of specific days that would never happen, conversations that would never occur, experiences that were foreclosed by violence. The memorial services and scholarship funds and victims' rights advocacy represented attempts to preserve memory and generate meaning from absence, but they could not restore what had been taken. The arithmetic of loss was simple and absolute. 5 lives ended, leaving gaps that could not be filled by justice or remembrance or time. Havers thought about the case occasionally in his retirement, usually when driving through parts of Phoenix that had not yet been developed, where the desert still pressed against the road and the sky opened up in all directions. He remembered the specific weight of the investigation, the way each new rose had felt like both confirmation and defeat, proof of pattern and proof of failure to stop the pattern before it extended. He remembered the moment of Prescott's arrest, the dark van idling in the parking lot, the quiet efficiency with which the man was taken into custody. He remembered Rachel Stokes, who had survived by screaming at the right moment, by having a stranger nearby who responded to her fear. The case had taught him that patterns were visible only in retrospect, that prevention required the impossible task of seeing the future before it arrived. The investigation had succeeded by narrowing possibilities until the pattern intersected with observation at exactly the right moment. The combination of witness testimony, geographical analysis, and systematic surveillance had created the conditions for Prescott's arrest, but it had required luck as much as methodology. That was the uncomfortable truth that Havers carried into retirement. Competence was necessary, but not sufficient, and sometimes stopping a pattern required chance to align with preparation in ways that could not be engineered or guaranteed. The scholarly attention paid to the case in subsequent decades produced various interpretations and theories about Prescott's motivations and methods. Criminologists analyzed the geographical distribution of crime scenes, the timing between murders, the victim selection criteria. Psychologists examined the ritualistic elements, the rose signature, the careful positioning of bodies as expressions of underlying psychological structures. Cultural critics wrote about the media coverage, about how the rose killer narrative had shaped public perception, about the ways that serial murder cases become cultural texts that reveal broader anxieties about randomness and vulnerability. The case became, in academic discourse, an example of various theories about criminal behavior, media influence, investigative methodology. This accumulation of interpretation added layers of meaning that extended far beyond the specific facts of 5 murders in Phoenix between 1983 and 1985. The transformation from lived tragedy to analytical object was inevitable, perhaps even necessary for understanding patterns across cases, but it carried its own ethical weight. The women who died remained individuals with specific stories, even as their deaths became data points in larger conversations about violence and investigation and justice. The roses themselves, which had given the case its public name and its most recognizable feature, existed now primarily as symbolic elements rather than physical objects. The actual roses that Prescott had placed on bodies had withered and been discarded long ago, photographed and catalogued, and then released to nature's decay. The roses found in his van had been preserved briefly as evidence, then disposed of after the trial concluded. What remained was the image of roses, the idea of them as markers of death rather than life, their cultural meaning permanently altered by association with murder. Florists in Phoenix stopped featuring red roses in their window displays for several years after the trial, conscious of the uncomfortable resonance. The flower's traditional associations with love and beauty had been contaminated by Prescott's perverse appropriation. This was another form of damage, smaller than the loss of life but real nonetheless. The case had changed the meaning of a common symbol, added darkness to something that had carried primarily positive connotations. Language and symbol were vulnerable to redefinition through violence, and the roses exemplified how specific cases could alter the cultural vocabulary of entire communities. The lessons extracted from the investigation became part of training protocols used by law enforcement agencies across the country. The importance of recognizing patterns across jurisdictions, the value of witness testimony, even when details were fragmentary, the need for coordination between patrol officers and detectives, the usefulness of behavioral profiling as investigative tool rather than solution. The case demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of systematic investigation. The pattern had been identified relatively early, after the 3rd rose appeared, but identifying the pattern did not immediately produce an arrest. The breakthrough had required patient accumulation of details, strategic surveillance, and the fortunate intersection of Prescott's continued hunting with an alert patrol officer's observation. The methodology could be taught and replicated, but the specific circumstances that led to success were not entirely reproducible. Each case developed according to its own logic, required its own combination of analysis and observation and chance. The Rose Killer investigation succeeded, but success was not inevitable. Other cases remained unsolved despite similar investigative approaches. The difference between resolution and continued mystery often came down to small moments, to whether a witness happened to look at the right time, to whether a suspect made a minor error that created opportunity for observation. The training materials that emerged from the case emphasized both methodology and humility, both systematic approach and recognition that certainty was never guaranteed. The families of the 5 women formed connections that persisted across decades. Bound by shared experience of loss and the particular circumstances of that loss, they maintained contact through annual memorial gatherings, through phone calls on difficult anniversaries, through advocacy work that transformed grief into action. Some families moved away from Arizona, seeking distance from the places where tragedy had occurred. Others remained, finding that leaving felt like abandonment of memory. There was no single correct response to the aftermath of murder, no pathway through grief that worked universally. Each family navigated the specifics of their loss according to their own resources and needs. The community that formed among them represented one way of managing the isolation that violent death creates, the sense of existing in a reality that other people could sympathize with, but not fully understand. The connections they maintained were both support system and acknowledgement that certain experiences created permanent alterations in how one moved through the world. The case had ended with conviction and execution, but their relationship to the loss continued indefinitely, shifting shape but never fully resolving into acceptance or peace. The question of whether similar cases might exist elsewhere, either before or after Prescott's active period, occupied investigators who reviewed the files in later years. The distinctive Rose signature seemed unique, but behavior patterns could change, could be suppressed or expressed differently depending on circumstances. Cold case detectives in other jurisdictions occasionally contacted Phoenix to compare details, looking for possible connections to unsolved murders in different states or earlier time periods. Nothing concrete emerged from these inquiries. Prescott's known murders appear to represent the entirety of his pattern, a bounded series that began in 1983 and ended with his arrest in 1985. He maintained his silence on death row, offering no additional confessions, no revelations about other possible victims. The investigation remained officially closed, its parameters defined by the 5 documented murders and the single attempted abduction. But uncertainty always lingered at the edges of closed cases. The absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence. Investigators who spent careers working serial cases learned to live with the possibility that they might never know the complete truth about any particular offender's history. Prescott took whatever additional knowledge he possessed to his execution, leaving only the documented pattern and the questions that extended beyond it into speculation and uncertainty. The technological advances that transformed criminal investigation in the decades following the case would have made Prescott's pattern more difficult to sustain. DNA analysis, which was in its infancy in 1985, became routine by the 1990s. Surveillance cameras proliferated throughout urban spaces, creating digital records of movement that could be reviewed and cross-referenced. Cell phone records provided location data that could track individuals across geography and time. The gaps in observation that Prescott had exploited became progressively smaller as technology filled previously empty spaces with data collection. Whether this represented progress depended on one's perspective. Crimes became easier to solve, but privacy eroded in proportion to surveillance expansion. The trade-off between safety and autonomy remained a persistent tension in discussions about law enforcement methodology. The Rose killer case predated most of these developments, unfolding in a technological landscape that now seemed almost quaint in its limitations. Havers had worked with paper files and telephone calls and physical surveillance. The investigation had succeeded through traditional detective work, through careful observation and systematic follow-through. Later generations of investigators had access to tools that would have compressed the timeline significantly, but the fundamental approach remained similar. Recognize pattern, narrow possibilities, create conditions for observation, act when opportunity arose. The final reflection that Havers allowed himself in the years after retirement, when the case became memory rather than active investigation, concerned the nature of pattern itself. Human beings were pattern-seeking creatures, finding meaning in repetition, in the arrangement of elements across space and time. This capacity allowed for scientific discovery, artistic creation, the accumulation of knowledge through recognition of similarity and difference, but it also created vulnerability to those who understood that patterns could be both created and exploited. Prescott had constructed a pattern that served his private purposes, that imposed order onto violence according to logic, that made sense only within his disturbed psychology. The roses were his pattern, his signature, his way of marking acts that would otherwise be indistinguishable from random death. Investigators had recognized the pattern and used it to narrow the search, to identify behavior that stood out against the background noise of urban existence. The pattern was simultaneously what made Prescott dangerous and what made him catchable. This paradox defined the work of investigating serial crime. The offender's need to repeat created the very evidence that would eventually lead to their arrest. The pattern was both expression of compulsion and map toward its own termination. Havers had spent his career studying patterns, learning to see connections that others missed, understanding that the world was not random but structured by cause and effect, by human behavior that followed psychological logic even when that logic was twisted or incomprehensible. The Rose killer case represented the culmination of this skill, the moment when pattern recognition became critical to stopping ongoing violence. But it also taught him about the limits of pattern recognition. The pattern was only visible after multiple instances had occurred. The first rose was singular, potentially meaningless. The second created possibility of connection. Only the third, established pattern with enough certainty to justify resource allocation. By the time the pattern was clear, 3 women were already dead. This temporal lag was inevitable, built into the structure of serial crime. The first victim always died before anyone knew to look for a pattern. The pattern emerged retrospectively, through comparison and analysis, after damage had already been done. Prevention would have required seeing the future, predicting Prescott's behavior before it manifested. Investigation dealt with aftermath, with reconstruction, with identifying patterns that had already expressed themselves through violence. The distinction between prevention and investigation was not semantic but fundamental. Havers had become an expert investigator, but the nature of the work meant arriving too late to save lives, only in time to seek justice for deaths that had already occurred. This temporal reality produced specific psychological weight for investigators who worked serial cases. They carried knowledge of what could have been if the pattern had been recognized earlier, if the first victim's death had somehow triggered awareness that prevented subsequent deaths. The counterfactual haunted every major case. What if Catherine Brennan's body had been found sooner? What if the rose's significance had been immediately apparent? What if resources had been mobilized after the first death rather than the third? These questions had no answers because they described scenarios that did not happen, but they persisted as psychological accompaniment to successful investigation. Havers had solved the case, arrested the killer, seen justice delivered, but he still thought about the women who died between recognition of pattern and arrest of the perpetrator. Jennifer Caldwell was the third victim, her death the one that established pattern definitively. If the pattern had been recognized earlier, might she have lived? The question was unanswerable, but unavoidable. It represented the essential tragedy of serial crime investigation. Success measured by stopping ongoing death, rather than preventing death entirely. The broader implications of the case extended into questions about how society managed risk and safety in environments designed around individual autonomy and mobility. Phoenix in the 1980s exemplified American urban development patterns, sprawling and automobile-dependent, creating spaces where people moved through public areas in isolation, where anonymity was standard, where community oversight was minimal. These conditions facilitated both opportunity and loneliness, both independence and vulnerability. The same social structures that allowed people to live according to individual preferences also created gaps where predators could operate. Shopping center parking lots exemplified this paradox. They were public spaces that felt private, locations where people expected safety because of visibility and commercial activity, but where actual security was minimal. The transition between store and car represented a moment of maximum vulnerability, when people were distracted by bags and keys, when attention shifted from surroundings to immediate tasks. Prescott had understood this vulnerability and exploited it systematically. The societal response involved increased security, better lighting, more surveillance, all representing attempts to close the gap between public space and actual safety. But these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental structure remained unchanged. People still needed to shop, still needed to load groceries into cars, still moved through spaces in patterns that could be observed and exploited by anyone willing to invest time in surveillance. The case raised questions about the relationship between normalcy and violence that resisted comfortable answers. Prescott was not obviously disturbed, did not exhibit clear warning signs that might have prompted intervention before violence occurred. He maintained employment, paid his bills, interacted with neighbors and co-workers without incident. His surface functionality was not a disguise he maintained with difficulty, but apparently his actual daily experience. The ritualistic murder pattern existed alongside normal life rather than replacing it. He went to work, performed his job responsibilities, returned home, and within that ordinary routine he also surveilled victims, planned abductions, committed murders, and spent time arranging bodies with roses. The compartmentalization was not absolute, but it was effective. His co-workers noticed nothing unusual about his behavior or demeanor. His neighbors considered him quiet and polite. The property management company that employed him had no complaints about his work quality. The violence existed in a separate category from his public identity, accessed during specific activities, but not contaminating his ability to function normally in other contexts. This dual existence challenged assumptions about how disturbed psychology manifests behaviorally. The stereotype of the obviously troubled individual, the person whose pathology was evident to careful observers, did not apply. Prescott demonstrated that severe psychological disturbance could remain hidden beneath complete surface normalcy, that the capacity for ritualistic violence could coexist with mundane competence in daily life. This realization was disturbing because it suggested that traditional warning signs might not apply, that the next serial offender might be anyone, that surface presentation provided no reliable indicator of internal reality. The transformation of the case from active investigation to closed file to historical example occurred gradually across years and decades. While the investigation was ongoing, it dominated Havers's attention completely, consuming thoughts and energy, structuring days around interviews and evidence review and strategic planning. The arrest brought temporary relief, but the trial required sustained focus on presentation of evidence, preparation of witnesses, coordination with prosecutors. The conviction and sentencing marked closure of the immediate case, but appeals extended the legal process for years. Havers had retired before Prescott's execution, leaving the final chapter to be completed without his direct involvement. In retirement, the case became something to remember rather than something to work on, transformed from immediate responsibility to historical event. He spoke about it occasionally when former colleagues asked, when journalists researching serial crime contacted him for interviews, when he attended gatherings of retired law enforcement officers who shared war stories about significant cases. These retellings became standardized over time, shaped into narrative that emphasized key moments and decisions, that compressed 2 years of investigation into digestible story arc. The living complexity of the investigation, the hundreds of dead ends and false leads and tedious hours spent reviewing insignificant details, was lost in retrospective narration that focused on breakthrough moments and critical evidence. This transformation was natural, perhaps inevitable, but it also represented a kind of loss. The case as remembered was cleaner than the case as experienced, more coherent, more obviously logical in its progression from problem to solution. The actual investigation had been messier, more uncertain, full of moments when the pattern was unclear and the path forward was ambiguous. The families who lost loved ones experienced their own transformations over time, their relationship to grief evolving as years became decades. The immediate aftermath was characterized by shock and devastation, by an inability to comprehend that someone they loved was permanently gone. The trial provided structure and focus, converting grief into participation in the justice process. The conviction and sentencing offered a form of closure, though closure was perhaps the wrong word. The case was legally resolved, but the absence remained absolute. Life continued, but with a permanent hole where the person should have been. Over time, grief became integrated rather than overcome. The families learned to function, to engage with daily life, to experience joy and satisfaction despite the enduring loss. But certain dates remained difficult. Certain places evoked overwhelming memories. Certain songs or smells or small details could trigger grief that felt as fresh as it had been in the immediate aftermath. The advocacy work that some family members pursued provided meaning and purpose, transforming their experience into something that might prevent similar tragedies for others. This did not erase their own loss, but gave it additional dimension, created legacy from absence. The memorial scholarships, the victims' rights legislation, the support networks for families of murder victims all represented ways that personal tragedy generated institutional change. The 5 women whose deaths defined the case became, through these efforts, more than victims. They became catalysts for reforms that addressed broader patterns of how society responded to violent crime and supported those affected by it. The silence of the desert returned after the arrests and trials and executions were complete. Phoenix continued growing, lights spreading across darkness, construction replacing open space. The specific locations where bodies had been found became indistinguishable from surrounding development, absorbed into the city's expansion. The case existed now in archives, in file boxes stored in climate-controlled rooms, in digital databases that preserved photographs and reports and testimony. The physical evidence had been destroyed after the appeals process concluded, following standard protocols for case closure. The roses, the map, the contents of Prescott's van, all of it had been catalogued and stored and eventually disposed of, reduced to documentation and memory. What remained was the structure of the investigation itself, the pattern of its unfolding, the lessons extracted from specific tragedy and transformed into general knowledge. The case had entered the permanent record, available for study and analysis, removed from its original context of fear and urgency, and transformed into something both more abstract and more permanent. The women who died were remembered by those who loved them, and mourned by families who carried their absence forward through time. The investigation that brought their killer to justice was remembered by those who worked it, and studied by those who came after. And the desert held its secrets in silence, vast and indifferent, containing the past without commenting on it, stretching in all directions toward horizons that dissolved in heat and distance, and the passage of years that turned specific events into history, and history into the foundation for whatever came next.